Welcome, bienvenue. My name is Renee Ketchum, and I curate with my team the cultural events of AFUSA. Welcome today to Paris Goods, Luxury Retailing and the Emergence of Les Grands Magasins of Paris with Roger Mummert.
Well, thank you.
The Alliance Française, AFUSA, is the largest Alliance Française network in the world, helping 25,000 learners of French each year. See our little video, please. So to help you learn French, live French, and love French, please log into www.afusa and see what we have coming up, including Scott Carpenter, French Cinematheque hosted by Peter de Bruges of Variety, and many other upcoming events. A few logistics and format today. Please stay on mute during the presentation, stay on speaker view, and please put all of your questions in the chat. If you have any technical issues, sign back in after a couple of minutes using the original Zoom link. This event is being recorded for our YouTube channel, and the total runtime is 1 hour. So again, we are thrilled to welcome back Roger Mummert. Roger is the creator of theparisproject.net, which explores the history of Paris as a city of ideas. His AF national presentations include Paris, a City of Ideas, Myths and Mysteries of the Bastille, and D-Day and the Soul of France, all available on YouTube. Roger Mummert's writing on culture, literature, and travel can be found in the archives of the New York Times and elsewhere. So welcome back, Roger. We're thrilled to have you as part of the program today.
Oh, thank you so much, Renee. It's always a pleasure to work with the Alliance Française. It takes me back to fond memories of taking classes at the Alliance on Boulevard Raspail in Paris back in my student days. I think I showed you my ticket, my identification card for what I looked like at that time. We won't bring that up, but yes. Yeah, so I am just honored to take up the challenge of presenting Paris goods and the rise of retailing and luxury goods and Les Grands Magasins in Paris. To do some research on this, I had the pleasure of going to Paris in February of this year. I don't know if anybody's been there in February, but it's a great time to go. Friends say, well, how was it? I said, well, it was typical Paris, cold, rainy, overcast, great museum weather. And I was able to see 17 museums in 1 week. That time of year, lines are short, and I got a Paris museum pass for 6 days and just zipped in. One key exhibit was La Saga des Grands Magasins at the Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine. This was the second of a two-part series that began last year with La Naissance des Grands Magasins at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, two great museums. Now, together, the shows tell the birth of and the story of these uniquely Parisian cathedrals of commerce, as they came to be known, and they tell how Paris emerged and flourished as the world's celebrated center for goods of unsurpassed quality and luxury, known as Les Articles de Paris, or Paris goods. Can we have the next slide, please? Now, on my return, I got to Charles de Gaulle and then came to the dreaded weigh-in counter. That's where you're told you've got to check and pay for a second bag. That's the bulging rollerboard that you brought over empty. Well, next to me was a fellow traveler doing the transfer of shame. She had her suitcase and rollerboard splayed out one next to the other, toiletries and unmentionables, all in plain sight, and she was moving a stack of Hermes scarves from one bag to the other. But the Air France agent was unyielding. You need to lose 2 more kilos. The agent then suggested she remove a bulky paper bag from her rollerboard, but the traveler recalled, oh, no, I'm eating that on the plane. It's the best sandwich in Paris. At this point, I had to engage. The best sandwich in Paris? Oh, absolutely. It's from Le Petit Vendôme. Oh, where's that? Oh, it's a tiny little place, but it's so easy to find. It's right behind Chanel. Right behind Chanel, I hear. You know, there was a time when I might have heard somebody say, it's on the right bank by Place Vendôme, but Paris is the city of luxury fashion brands, and Chanel, Louis Vuitton, Dior, these are the nouveau Paris landmarks. Let's talk about retail beginnings and go back a bit in time. Oh, about 400 years is usually when I concentrate on with the ParisProject.net. But even earlier, we're going to go out back into medieval times when commerce was conducted on the bridges and quays of Paris. Now, commerce, in one form or another, is as old as civilization. Our story of the Paris goods begins on the bridges and quays and in the marketplaces of the medieval city. It was there from the 12th to the 15th centuries that Paris emerged as the city to be visited for its beauty and its vibrancy, for its fashions, arts, crafts, and collectibles of unsurpassed quality. Now, how do we know this? Well, remarkably, we have records and illustrations of commerce that took place then and descriptions of the goods that drew travelers from afar. This is an illustration from the life of Saint Denis, dates a manuscript dating from 1317, and we'll talk about that in the next slide when we talk about merchants and consumers of this medieval period into the Renaissance. Next slide, please. Now, in 1317, a small manuscript with tiny illustrations called miniatures was presented to King Philippe V. It was called The Life of Saint Denis, after the Bishop of Lutetia. Now, it's the ancient city that became Paris. Now, the bishop and later Saint Denis inspired a remarkable legend. In the 3rd century, Bishop Denis was beheaded for refusing to renounce his Christian faith. He then picked up his head and walked to from his place of execution, which is now called Montmartre or Hill of Martyrs. Several miles he walked to the place that became Saint Denis Basilica and the tomb of French kings. Now, all the while, Bishop Denis delivered a sermon via his disconnected head. The text of the manuscript recounts this tale, but 29 of its 77 illustrations, some of them beautifully illustrated, you see here, depict something far different and quite rare. Scenes of commerce in medieval Paris. This at a time when most art was religious art. Now, a great deal of what we know about the trades and professions and markets at that time come from these 29 miniatures found in the life of Saint Denis. As we see here, we see an apothecary selling a potion here in the center. There's a barrel of wine being purchased at the top right. Now, by law, the merchants of wine had to remain in the Seine. That we see a pig driven to market. We see a money changer, a silversmith, a porter. These are scenes of everyday life, and I think it's really remarkable that we have these. Let's talk about, in the next slide, commerce in medieval Paris. Now, we also have written accounts that corroborate these illustrations from the life of Saint Denis. The manuscript of the life of Saint Denis is pictured at the top left there. That's in the Bibliothèque Nationale. And the depiction of Saint Denis carrying his head while sermonizing is there at the top right. A number of books illustrate this very legend and tell us about what's going on in these illustrations. City on the Seine there at the lower left, the time of Louis IX, 1226, 1270. Now, under the reign of this Capetian king, France coalesces from disparate provinces into a country, and records of Paris from that time show well-established markets, they show market fairs, and they show the regulation of merchants by a prévôt de marchand. Le Diderot de Paris is an extraordinary poem. It's called Le Diderot, or the saying of the streets of Paris, the reciting. And the poem cites 30 street names from this time in the great Parisian labyrinth. Now, streets are named for professions: Boucherie, woodcutter; Rue de Poissonnerie, the fishmonger; Rue des Cordiers, the shoemakers were on the street; Rue de Pelleterie, furriers were found here. Also, a depiction of the book is a great description of it is in the book on the medieval bridges of Paris in the 14th century, and annotates everything that's in here and discusses the goldsmiths, the apothecaries, the wine merchants, and farmers that we see here driving some livestock to market. And it illustrates all these acts of commerce that happened at this point, largely on the bridges. Let's move on to marketplaces. Now, over time, commerce left the bridges and came on land, as you see in the center picture there by the side of the Seine. And finally, they were then in marketplaces under canopies and then in pavilions, as you see in these illustrations. Now, look at the map here, which tells a lot of how the marketplaces developed. Once they left the central Ile de la Cité, we see the port for grain and wine on the left bank, port for wheat on the right bank. You see on the left routes of salt and herring coming up the Seine from the sea. And then we see some of the established markets. There's a pork market and a street named for fishermen there. But there is Les Halles, which was first established in 1183 by King Philippe Auguste, and of course grew greatly from there. In the next slide, we see that this commerce not only was flourishing, but it was regulated. And it was regulated by and taxed, and overseeing it was a prévôt de marchand. Now, Etienne Boileau was the famous first prévôt de Paris, and he served in that office in 1261 to 71. Effectively, he was mayor of the city. He licensed and regulated commerce, but he also had power of law enforcement. All right, we're going back to the 16th century when sumptuary laws restricting luxury spending and forbidding the dressing above your station were issued. Okay, this is after the regulation of commerce. We talk about the regulation of luxury. The next slide. If we can go to the next slide. Oh, okay, here we go. So here, it is forbidden by these sumptuary laws to dress above your station. Now, what was a station? In Ancien regime, there were three estates. And we see here the first estate represented by the man in purple. He is the clergy. And the second is the nobility or noblesse de l'épée, because he's carrying a sword. That is the nobility who's in charge of the military. And they both seem to be riding on the poor back of the third estate, that is the peasant, the working urban poor, and the bourgeoisie, which had yet to really develop into what we think of as the bourgeois, the great middle class. But they're all riding on the back of the third estate, and there is an interesting caption at the bottom of this, and we were discussing its interpretation. It's written a little kind of a funny ancient way, but it appears to say that there is hope that this game will end soon. And I take that to be the game of the nobility and the clergy riding on the backs of the peasants and who are taxed and they are not. And so that did end soon with the French Revolution. But this tells us also something about how people dressed in very distinct ways, and it was forbidden to do otherwise. Now, in the 17th century, Louis the 13th also restricted the superfluidity of dress. Only princes and nobility could wear gold embroidery on their clothing or have ribbons attached to it. And there's a very interesting play later in that century by Molière called Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, or the Bourgeois Gentleman. Itself a kind of pun, because you could not be a gentleman if you were bourgeois. You had to be noble. And in this, a social climbing bourgeois whose father had made a fortune in the cloth trade buys new clothes and is mistaken for a nobleman. However, he is unmasked when he opens his mouth. So he takes lessons in locution and philosophy, and he learns to fence. Still, he lacks the savoir-faire of a nobleman, and he remains a fool taken for his money, no matter how well he is dressed. Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme. It's a wonderful Molière play. If we move to the next slide, we are up to I'm sorry. Oh, yes, trades in Renaissance Paris. Now, as the Middle Ages transitioned into the Renaissance, the 15th to the 17th century, commerce developed along with it. We see two forms of commerce. On the left, these are trades which are regulated by the guilds, and on the right, we see street commerce, where people mostly wear the wares that they're selling. So, in the center are some of the finer goods for which people came to Paris: the tapestries, the cloths, the wigs, and scientific instruments, and so forth. So while there were guilds making fine articles, on the right side we see the streets were filled with street merchants who were less regulated, selling brooms, umbrellas, and home goods and services and such. In the next slide, we get a closer look at the street commerce of Renaissance Paris. Street merchants hawk their wares with cries or songs of their offerings. These are recorded in Les Cris de la Vie, which is a wonderful book that chronicles, as you see here, some of the merchants wonderfully illustrated. But some of them here, if we look on the right, have musical notations as to what their cry was. I don't read music well, but the woman carrying water there on the right side, top left, why says, Allah ho ho, put her together with the fellow below that's singing his song about sharpening knives and all the other merchants. And you can imagine what the marketplace sounded like. In fact, I ran across on YouTube, there's a recording called Voulez ou les Cris de Paris, you should look up because a wonderful composer put together a kind of choral concert in which he assigned these different songs or cries to people in the chorus, and you get a wonderful sense of the market. You're really transported back 400 or 500 years. Let's go now to a little political aside, the Bourbon monarchs and the first ministers.
Roger, before we go into the Bourbons, I'm wondering if
Oh,
we
yeah.
could just interject with one question. Did the guilds contribute to the development of luxury goods in Paris? Did they promote métiers or limit career opportunities in mass manufacturing?
That's an excellent question. And I think they did both. I think the guilds were one of the reasons why Paris is the place of luxury today. The guilds maintained quality and and they also limited the numbers of people. The apprenticeships for guilds was extraordinarily long, 5 years, 7, 8 years that you would work with no money at all. And then you could be a journeyman in the middle. And if you didn't have the means, you had to take a test to be a master and also have the means to conduct business, to hire people and conduct a shop. If you didn't, you ended up in the middle making almost no money. So for some, it was a wonderful pathway, and if your father was in the guild, you had an entree to getting into the guild, but they very much restricted the numbers. Now, it could be argued that this restriction, as we go a little bit further into the Industrial Revolution, made Paris very much a city of artisans, of craftspeople, and not a manufacturing city, such as you had in London or Manchester and some other large cities. That was also due to the fact that it was a walled city. And we'll get to that a little bit later when we talk about the speculation. So I think guilds did a great deal to keep the quality of goods and craftsmanship high. At the same time, they restricted to many people the ability to rise into that class. And because of the walls, there were guild artisans inside the city, and there were artisans on the outside of the city who were not guild people, who were restricted from ever going that route, but who still produced goods. Well, so generally, I think a good thing, and I think it's one of the reasons that Paris is the city of luxury. So we're going to talk about the Bourbon monarchs. If we could go to that slide, please. In the in the 2 centuries leading up to the Revolution, France was ruled by 5 Bourbon kings. We're going to talk in particular about 2 of them, Henri IV there on the left, and his grandson Louis XIV, who had the greatest effect on the city of Paris and on fashion as well. At this time in the Bourbon rule, there were 3 political ideas that really shaped the era: urbanism, centralization, and mercantilism. The Bourbon rule begins with Henri IV in 1589. He was called the first urbanist king and a city planner because he believed that the lives of Parisians and the prosperity of the city could be improved by state projects with private investment. He created open spaces for commerce and built infrastructure, bridges, factories, schools, and hospitals. Now, Louis XIV, throughout the Grand Siècle of the 17th century, centralized power at the Versailles court. In the process, and to his advantage, he systematically weakened the power of the nobility. Fashion actually played a role in this. And also under the guidance of his first minister, and with these Bourbon kings, a great deal of what happened is due to the first ministers that you see here, Richelieu and Mazarin in particular. So under First Minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Louis XIV embraced mercantilism. That is a favorable balance of trade. This is a rather topical subject given what's happened in the last week and what's happened today with regard to the trade tariffs. At this time, France imposed stiff tariffs to maximize exports and minimize imports. Sell abroad, buy at home was the cry. And fashion was at the center of this tariff war, which specifically protected French textiles and lace. Also, artisans and experts in cloth manufacturing were lured to Paris from Italy and elsewhere. Let's talk about transforming Paris in detail in the next slide. And we go back to Henri IV, Henry IV, le bon roi, le ver galant. The essence of the charming Frenchman, said he, I make war, I make love, and I build. Well, they say he said it, but anyway, what he built was notable. Here are two examples. We're going to look a couple, and two others from Louis XIV's time. First on the left is Place Royale. We know it today as Place des Vosges, built 1605, 1612. Now, Henry IV was concerned that France was losing the silk trade to Italy. He designed a project to boost domestic manufacture. Place Royale was designed as an open square, the first of several royal squares, surrounded by four pavilions. It still is today. It's a wonderful place. Now, three of these pavilions would contain retail shops, and above them, luxury housing suitable for nobility. But the fourth pavilion, the one nearest to the bottom, in fact, would contain a silk factory and worker housing. 500,000 mulberry trees to host silkworms were planted all around Paris for this. Now, the traditional means of funding such a project was to command money from the nobility, who in turn squeezed it out of their peasants. But instead, Henri IV turned to wealthy bourgeois financiers. He offered them in return the right to rent out and manage the retail spaces. Now, today, this would be called a mixed-use project with private equity funding. Henri IV was ahead of his time. His bigger project, never completed because of his assassination in 1610, was Place de France, there pictured at the top right. It was to be a colossal live, work, play project, central marketplace, offices, workshops, and dwelling. Now, the splayed out design that you see here, similar to Étoile, was meant to reach out and embrace the provinces and promote commerce between Paris and the countryside and beyond. Now, plans, as I say, were cut short after his assassination, but had this Place de France been completed, it's likely that commerce in Paris would have been centered in the Marais district. Now, outlines of the Grand Plan still are evident, with several semicircular streets that you can still see in the area known as the Haute Marais. Boulevards and circulation was another great improvement. Now, this under Louis XIV. Louis XIV spent his childhood in Paris, but very little of his adult life there, especially once Versailles was built. Yet he had a profound effect on the city. He demolished the defensive walls and turned these open spaces into boulevards. Now, these wide new streets refreshed the city. Parisians could travel across town. Goods could easily be brought in from the countryside. He also introduced streetlights and a police force, both good things for commerce. Louis XIV thought big, and there's one quote again attributed to him when he said, "Build, always build. Someone else will pay for it later." Now, promoting arts and fashion. Louis XIV was a great supporter of the arts and fashion. In 1668, he issued an edict that extravagant dress must be worn at court, and that be made only of French cloth and by French manufacturers. Ladies had to wear a dress called the grand habit de cour, an elegant dress that displayed décolletage. Louis XIV had a jacket designed for himself known as a juste corps à brevet, and male courtiers could also wear such a vestment with the king's permission only to accompany him while riding and hunting. Now, at court, there was a constant need for these new costumes and special costumes for balls and celebrations. This was all part of the king's plan. He was purposely driving his courtiers into debt over clothes. And then once they were impoverished, he paid for their clothes, which further increased their indebtedness to Le Roi Soleil. Now, at this time, fashion was a huge industry. We're talking about the middle of the 17th century. Nearly 1 million of 23 million Frenchmen, a third of all wage earners in Paris, were employed in the clothing industry. The state sought to expand its fashion assets beyond borders. French fashion dolls, which served as samples, were dressed in the latest designs and sent around the world. Orders then were mailed back to Paris for costumes to be made for occasions such as coronations and balls. Paris was unmistakably the center of the fashion world. Next slide tells us something about life in Paris and I'll discuss this just briefly. We have many literary accounts of what that was like. Two in particular, yes, in the center there, Panorama de Paris, also known as Le Tableau de Paris, is by Louis-Sébastien Mercier, who wrote of the society of Paris in the 18th century, just up to and after the Revolution. A different account of life in the streets was written by Restef de la Breton. He was known as the Night Owl. His book Le Nuit de Paris, Le Nuit de Paris, I'm sorry, described what the nightlife was like, the demi-monde, the seamier side of Paris at that time. At the top left, this wonderful book at Old Paris, which is a compilation from six different visitors to Paris from Italy and Spain and Russia. Many of them were there on business or state business, and they described what Paris was like from the Middle Ages all up to the 18th century. They were dazzled by what was available there and the luxury they saw, and at the same time, they were somewhat aghast at the filthiness of the city, the smell of the place, the raw sewage that littered the streets there. But one Italian visitor writes in 1692, luxury here is in such excess that to enrich 300 deserted cities, it would suffice to plunder Paris. There are shops here selling things one doesn't even need. And there were a number of, at the right, you see a number of descriptions of Paris by visitors from London in particular. Arthur Young, an agrarian political writer, he writes that in the art of living, the French have been esteemed by the rest of Europe. Every man who can afford a great table in Europe has a French cook. And I would note also the Galignani guides, which became very popular in the 19th century, still operating a store, the Galignanis, on Rue de Rivoli, and have continuously published these guides to Paris, which are really fascinating accounts, mostly of monuments that you find there, but some of the commerce and Paris goods that can be found there. Now let's skip over a big part of history called the French Revolution and take a look at that other revolution that was happening at the time, the Industrial Revolution. On the next slide, please. Several economics were at play as we enter the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, the emergence of travel, and the rise of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie with disposable income and leisure time, the travel that brought visitors from England and from the United States there on excursions. Now, pictured here are several things from the Musée des Arts et Métiers. I can't say enough about that. It's a wonderful museum about science, technology of the period right up to the present, but mostly about the Industrial Revolution on. And these are artifacts that are found there. It's just a wonderful collection. We see here at the left generators to power large buildings and factories. Of course, the efficiency of machinery. Here we see an enhanced loom here that's producing cloth. We see steam travel by ship and rail that also transported goods to the city as well as people that were coming. In the next slide, we talk about the measures of commerce. I don't want to overlook the fact that you need to measure to manage, as they say in business, and you can't have an industrial revolution without standard measures. Now, in the top here in the center is a piece of marble that's attached to a building on Rue de Vaugirard, and it says mètre. It is the mètre étalon, or rather the standard meter. I have to say, I must have walked through this countless times on my way over to class at Alliance Française, and I never noticed it. I never noticed it until finally I saw a book, I read a book called The Measure of Paris, in which the author, Stephen Scobie, describes this as a metaphor by how we all experience Paris, reading the text of the city. This is a very important piece of the text of the city, and you should go there, just touch it, because this little piece of stone and the calibrations on it that give you a standard meter have a lot to do with why Paris looks as it does today. So lay hands on it, just touch it. It's like touching the Western Wall or maybe the Blarney Stone. But it was designed, the Mètre étalon, was designed to promote the metric system embraced by the First Republic. And 16 of these were placed at various places around the city. 2 remain. This is the only one in place where it was original. So a Parisian could take a piece of string there and stretch it out over the meter and make a little knot at one end and the other, and you'd have what a standard meter is. You take a piece of wood and trace it and notch the calibrations in between the ends. And this would tell you what a standard meter would. Now, why is that important? So now when you're purchasing a piece of property or a length of silk fabric to make a dress, you can measure your purchase, and you know that you're getting a square deal. Below that are some other measures from the arts and métier that show how mass is measured, liquid measurements, and the circumference is measured for tooling and pipes and such. And so that's part of what made possible the Industrial Revolution and made possible the mass merchant and the mass production of goods that could go into a grand department store that we're going to talk about. Now, we're looking at changing retail values in the next slide. The 19th century saw an enormous change in the retail landscape as we go from the traditional shop and the shop window through which goods were sold, and the atelier behind it, the workshop where many goods were manufactured or finished, to something that emerged in the early 19th century, the passage couvert, or the covered shopping arcade. From there, we go to the Magasin Nouveauté, a kind of a variety store in which various goods that once were sold simply in one shop or another, now we're under one roof. And then finally, that morphed into the Grand Magasin that we're going to talk about here. Now, going back and looking in particular at the shop window, let's note one thing about the development of Paris. Commerce and social classes grew to be stacked vertically. The atelier and shop were located on the rez-de-chaussée, the ground floor. The owner lived above the shop on what in Europe is called the first floor, of course, and the second and third floors were occupied by bourgeois families of means, and above that were working families, and then shop workers and apprentices were stuffed into the garret under the roof. Now, customers, as you see here on the left, at the bottom, often made purchases through a shop window. Now, that left them standing on the street, the infamously malodorous Paris street amid open sewers, mud, and filth. If we go to the next slide, we see the innovation that changed all that and brought shoppers inside. It was the passage couvert. And as the new century dawned, Paris saw an explosion of passage couvert, or covered shopping arcades that brought customers indoors. The new spaces were attractive. There were skylit ceilings and large shop windows that displayed goods. Both of those innovations made possible by the industrial manufacture of large glass panels. These arcades were also lit with gas lanterns night and day. They glittered, these arcades, that encouraged social gatherings. They were a fashionable place to see and be seen, and here social classes mixed. Bourgeois shoppers were served by shop girls, called grisettes for their gray uniforms, and les grisettes came from the working class, often the young single women from the provinces. They became the topic of steamy literature, portrayed either as apple-cheeked innocence or faulted for their brazen flirtatiousness, the assumption being that they sought husband or lover. The Arcades Project is the major opus of social theorist Walter Benjamin. Writing in the 1930s, Benjamin describes these passages as selling machines for the industrially produced commodities in this new age of capitalism. Their gaslights attracted flaneurs, like moths to a flame. This new interior world of private space for public activity contributed to the phantasmagoria of life in what Benjamin calls Paris, the capital of the 19th century. Now, they exist in the 21st century too, and you really should go visit them. Galerie Vivienne is one of my faves. Take a look at the map, or those maps are available to show that most of the Passage Couvert, and there must be at least 20 or more, that still exist, still operate with shops, are clustered in the right bank, mostly around the Palais Royal and the Bibliothèque Nationale. And it's just great to step off the street and suddenly you're in a quieter space. There's still the hubbub of shoppers and these little boutiques, many of which are fast food stores now, not once with that at the top left, you see somebody selling umbrellas there. That was traditional, but there's still a great experience just to walk between blocks and to kind of change the temperature of your Paris experience. It's really great. Now, this gave way to Les Magasins de Nouveauté, the period being 1830 to 1850, if we see the next slide. And yeah, these were novelty stores, as we said, with a variety of offerings, a departure from specialty stores. Under one roof, you could purchase cloth for a new dress, New shoes, hats, maybe an umbrella. Seasonal fashions were introduced here, and frequent shopping was encouraged. And it wasn't long before they really morphed into the next and grandest form of shopping in Paris. With the next slide will show us les grands magasins. And yes, here are five stores, founded all in the 19th century, still operating today. And in contrast to many of the department stores that struggle here in our country, they are bustling. I visited all of these in the last several years, and in fact, four of them in the last 2 months. And I can tell you, they are booming. Top left, Galerie Lafayette. Next door is the Printemps. You have to go there if you're traveling with teenage or college age fashionista daughters, and just they'll get lost there and just love it. They're colossal examples of great fashion and boutiques within great department stores. Printemps has the famed cafe on the rooftop, great place for lunch. Galerie Lafayette has a rooftop, great place for sunsets and nighttime. Across the water in the left bank is Bon Marché, the store that started it all. And this in particular shows the Grande Épicerie, a food court to beat the band, not to be outdone anywhere, I think. And top right is the Samaritain, which is operating now. It was closed for 20 years and came back bigger, not bigger, but grander and just restored. And it's a fantastic experience. And lower right is what was the Bazaar Hôtel de Ville, or the BHV, named because it's across from the Hôtel de Ville on Rue de Rivoli there in the what begins the Marais, and right across the street from the Paris tourist office, which unfortunately doesn't have a bathroom, but they'll tell you, oh, go over across the street to BHV, fourth floor, bathrooms. So we're going to go to the next slide and talk about the real entrance of Les Grands Magasins, 1872. Now, Bon Marché was opened in 1852, but it's reopening as a Grand Magasin 20 years later. It set off a seismic boom in retailing. It forever changed the face of retailing in Paris and beyond. The store introduced innovations in design with this grandiose Beaux-Arts building of iron construction, skylit galleries, glass ceilings, escalators, and elevators. It was Parisians' first encounter with such things. In retailing, it offered multiple departments under one roof. There were fixed prices, cash sales, and fast checkouts. Ease of purchase was the idea, and it had low prices based on supplier contracts and volume purchases. There was rapid turnover inventory and improved cash flow. As the owner Boucicaut said, circulate the capital as often as possible. That was the saying, and it brought luxury into the hands of many Parisians. Luxury was democratized. And there were also the excitement of events there and the excitement of the sales, which were introduced. Le Blanche, the white sale that was conducted there in every January. I can still remember my mother going to white sales at department stores when I was a kid. In terms of service, it was intensive, one-on-one service. A clerk would greet a customer and guide them through the entire colossal store. They needed a guide because it was so large. There were style outs for customers. They were encouraged to touch the goods, try them on. There were easy returns. This is in great contrast to the kind of behind the counter, one piece at a time techniques of the specialty stores. There were finishers and tailors on hand. There were garçons, hundreds of them at Bon Marché, who would carry your packages for you, deliver them down to take them down to the loading dock, and they would be put into carriages and delivered to your home. Everything was made easy. And in terms of merchandising, there was just a dizzying array of goods in all categories. There was fabric cascading off of tables and onto the floors. There were atriums filled with aerial displays and balloons and such. And there were creative window displays. All these were new innovations. Next slide, please. Retail as spectacle. A seduction of the senses. Shopping now was a spectacle that seduced the senses. Some shoppers became overcome with this new phenomenon. It was called shoppers' hysteria. They were immersed in a sea of goods, and they grabbed all they could hold. Store and customer had entered into a new relationship. In traditional shops, customers were met by the shop owner or clerk and asked, "What do you need?" And then shopping was a simple matter of fulfillment. Habit and customer loyalty sustained the shop. But at Bon Marché, customers could walk in with no obligation to buy and no particular need in mind. Est-ce que vous aidez? Oh, en regard, they might say. I'm just looking. They came to look, to be entertained, to see the show. And the show was constantly changing, so they came again and again. And when they walked out, they often did so with purchases of items they did not know they needed nor wanted when they came in. These were truly cathedrals of commerce, as we see in the next slide. And for the bourgeoisie, they were fashionable places to see and be seen. They were also the domain of women, acceptable public spaces for groups of women or even women shopping alone. And they were more than stores. They were activity centers. You could spend a day in the store, going from tea room to cafe. There were reading rooms and lecture rooms. They were cultural centers, offering recitals, chorus concerts, art shows, and lectures. They were a phenomenal success because they indulged shoppers in a new experience, sharing in a glorious dream of a gilded bourgeois lifestyle. Well, this dream affected even the staff. Working class clerks were enclosed in a world of bourgeois luxury, and some came to believe they were part of it. They comprised a kind of phantom social entity floating between working class and bourgeoisie, impoverished yet aspirational. Some took on airs. This may have been the beginning of the snooty store clerk. In the next slide, we'll see that the stores defined bourgeois life. The bourgeoisie makes the shop, and the shop makes the bourgeoisie. In this new relationship, they not only served the bourgeois class, they defined and expanded what comprised a bourgeois lifestyle. The stores educated their customers in clothing needs for all occasions and for all ages. Your children had to be part of this lifestyle. Home decor, furniture, china, and silver needs for everyday use and for formal entertaining. And they introduced bourgeois needs, as we see in the next slide, please. With more leisure time and greater disposable income came new activities and new needs for them. Proper wear for promenading around town and country. Proper wardrobe for vacationing. If you're summering in Deauville, well, you'll need a vacation wardrobe. Beach costumes and dresses for day, dresses for night. And outfits and accessories for newly popular activities like tennis, bicycling, and swimming, all sold under one roof, all at Bon Marché or at Printemps or Galeries Lafayette. And in the next slide, we'll see the influence of how the Paris style went global, largely by way of catalog. This catalog was printed frequently and sent out by the thousands of people, not just in Paris, but in the provinces and, in fact, in other countries, other continents. And it introduced these new leisure activities of skiing, of country sports, activities that people, consumers, bourgeois consumers, didn't even know about or know that they needed. And this was, as we see in the next slide, the golden age of the store poster. Just beautiful posters are seen. You can find some of these old ones looking around Paris or even in New York also. I think they're wonderful illustrations, but they're sales pieces for a lifestyle. You're not just shopping. You're living a gilded bourgeois lifestyle. Luxury is yours, they say. It's well within reach. Take it. Step inside the store. Come in. You belong here. Be the woman in the poster. In the
One
next slide,
quick question.
yes,
Can we
okay.
interject for a second?
Yeah.
We've talked about this before in your presentation before, but how did the role of women change with the experience of Les Grands Magasins and their
Oh,
promotion of the bourgeois lifestyle?
yes, I think it changed a great deal. Both the women who were working in the stores and the women who were shopping there. I mean, this was, as we said, it was a respectable, safe place for women to be by themselves. Now, generally in Paris, they differed perhaps from a lot of other cultures in that women had more of a comfortable place on the street. But these were places where women obviously could collect, could take part in cultural events. And it wasn't all shopping, as we said. They were living this kind of a lifestyle that went to art exhibits. Several of the stores I just visited 2 months ago, why they had art exhibits right in the center atrium and so forth. It still goes on today. So the life of women, the bourgeois lifestyle was expanding because there was greater prosperity. And frankly, in the Belle Époque, it was a time of relative peace and prosperity. So I think women had a greater role, perhaps in the family. They perhaps were more in charge of spending for the family, clothing the children, and so forth. And this was their partner in that, showing them how to do it, basically. I hope that answers your question in part. We're going to talk about the merchant princes and princesses in the next slide. Yeah, so fortunes were made serving the bourgeois lifestyle. Here is a group of the merchant princes and princesses who built great fortunes. And at the left is Aristide and Marguerite Boucicault, the founders of Bon Marché, originally Au Bon Marché. People just say Bon Marché. Their slogan was circulate capital as often as possible and make retail a spectacle, something grandiose. And they were also deeply Catholic, and they shared their values with their employees, whom they believed whose lives they could improve. Now, young single women were housed. They lived at the store. There was a dormitory on the top floor for them, and they were offered classes and improve their skills in language and mathematics and so forth. But the system that they adopted was the traditional business model, système familial. It was a paternalistic family-run system. They had their hand in everything, extremely hands-on, and it was their shop. There's no question. Um, Next, we see Jules Jalouzeau. He founded Printemps, and he took the store where the money was. Bon Marché was on the Rive Gauche because that's where it originally was, and was expanded there. But Printemps was put onto Boulevard Haussmann, right by the new homes of the bourgeois who lived in that in the ninth arrondissement and 8th and the 17th and so forth. He was a real innovator. Next door to him was the Galerie Lafayette, which was founded by two cousins from Alsace, Alphonse Kahn and Théophile Bader. They built the enormous soaring atrium, 43 meters high, as beautiful today as it must have been when it opened in 1894. Next to them is Chauchard and Henriot in a store called Les Grands Magasins de Louvre. Building is still there. It's no longer a Grand Magasin, but the building has many different shops in it. Next to them was Georges Dufayel, the Napoleon of credit. Now, he built a palace not for the bourgeoisie, but for the working class of Paris. He made it as glorious with statues and paintings as any of the other stores, but his goods were low-priced home goods, available on credit, 20% down, and then weekly and stuff. He furnished the working class homes of Paris. He also was a very colorful figure. He issued his own currency. He made tokens that were good at 400 other stores around France, and where sales were made there, he got his 18% back. And then finally, Cognac and Jay, a married couple that founded La Samaritain at the heady heights of luxury in Paris when that opened in 1870. Move to the next slide if we could. This crowd and others who were in charge of these really redefined retail business. These stores were designed as cathedrals of commerce, but they also were designed as selling machines. Every aspect was designed to be so. This cutaway of Printemps, it's typical. In the basement, you see the works of the building, the HVAC, if you will, the power station, but also an enormous kitchen and dining room for the employees, who, as we said, many of whom lived up on the top floor. Beneath that was some business aspects in the atelier or tailoring department, and in between was 5 enormous floors of selling and all different departments. So, this was all by design, and it was really, as I say, a selling machine. Emile Zola described it as a great steam engine. In the next slide, we're going to discuss the staff, which was an intensive operation, and thousands of employees here. We see Bon Marché employees standing for their annual picture. The store was also fond of doing kind of yearbook shots over here on the left, those are people who were in choruses. There were choruses and pageants put on by the staff. They participated in this. And we see some of the other functions of the store, the tailoring, the inventory, the enormous kitchen and dining room that served thousands of people, 3 seatings 3 times a day. Now, This was still run as a family operation, but it had to give way to some modern management techniques. Anything this large could not be run just by Papa and Mama and and a couple of children. It was the rise of middle management. Now, senior management may be family. Eventually, these stores developed corporate boards also that guided them. Middle management was male. Supervisors of female staff tended to be women, and sales and support was both men and women. And there were strict rules to maintain respectability, uniformity, and esprit de corps. Women were single. If they were married or found to be married, they were told, go collect your wages. This brought a great deal of social change, this mixing of classes and genders. So we see in the next slide, working class clerks came in close contact with bourgeois shoppers in intimate ways, presenting goods, fitting, tailoring, dressing, and undressing. Now, shop girls often were from the provinces, seeing Paris for the first time, and here they were immersed in the finery of a bourgeois life to which they could only aspire. What were the career options for women? Well, they were limited. That you could choose celibacy and have some option to stay at the store over time. You could choose marriage and leave, or you could be a mistress, in which case you were flirting with being fired. Sexual predation by male management seeking mistresses was not uncommon, and some shop girls invited patronage as a way up and out. But women were expected eventually to depart and become mothers and families, although some entered the business side and worked in accounting, customer service, catalogs, working alongside men, which is certainly a very new thing. I think we had some discussion on that, Renee, at this point. Was it a good thing for employees and for women? I think it's a very mixed picture. Yeah, I can't hear you, but I know that's what the question was.
No, we
Can you
talked
hear?
we talked earlier about how whether or not employees were treated well or exploited, and how do we assess this by current values and with historical perspective?
That is one of the great questions of how we look back in history and evaluate things. Why we can't judge by our standards today, but by our standards today, we would think they were treated pretty horribly. I mean, these are the employees, many of them were single women from the provinces, didn't have a sou, as they say, knew nothing of Paris, and they were just basically kept at the store at least 6 days a week. So from that standpoint, they were very much exploited, I think. I think it's fair to say. On the other hand, this was a way up and out for some who did succeed. And we're talking about the depiction in the great Zola novel, Au Bonheur des Dames. It is a depiction of someone who was victorious in, there you see it at the bottom, in getting out and surviving the system of somewhat abuse and predation, sexual harassment and so forth, and who finally did come to have a position at the store. This is a depiction of Les Grands Magasins in art and literature. We see this wonderful picture in the middle of bourgeois families gathering with their children. So it looks like it's almost like after church or the opera or something. Everybody's in their Sunday best and they're socializing in this great pool of light cast off by the Grand Magasin Galerie Lafayette. Picasso at the left. At the bottom, we see Charlie Chaplin doing battle with an escalator in the big store, and Marx Brothers getting in trouble there. But as I said, Au Bonheur des Dames is just a wonderful novel that tells the story of a woman who comes from the provinces, destitute and really with very few options, and she finds a way through the whole maze of employment at a store called Au Bonheur de Dame, or The Lady's Paradise is the translation from that. And there's a poignant scene at the end where her cousin has died and everyone's walking to the cemetery, and all the shopkeepers of the quartier who are struggling to survive against this giant department store are walking there. And one says, it's as if we all are walking to our graves along with that poor girl. So that's Emile Zola editorializing a little bit from his political perspective on how a giant store is putting small stores out of business and changing the nature of the quartier, the neighborhood in Paris. So very quickly, if we go to the next slide or two, I want to mention that not everything happened in the giant store. Yeah, the rise of the couturière. Now, couture is a word meaning sewing. Couturier is a lady's tailor, but a couturière is a lady's dressmaker, and there's quite a distinction between that. And looking back here to the Ancien Regime, the very famous Marie-Jeanne Rose Bertin, a noted dressmaker who had her own shop in the we're talking about in the Ancien Regime on Rue Saint-Honoré. She's known for these enormous gowns that took up 3 times the size of a man. She created gowns for royals and wealthy guys. And Marie Antoinette was so impressed that she made Bertin her Minister of Fashion. If anybody's watching the PBS series Marie Antoinette, there is a cameo with Rose Bertin just this past week in which a young Marie Antoinette is gushing, "Oh, I love your dresses. Would you please make one for me?" And she did indeed. She made a lot of them, and she actually survived the revolution and the terror and came out the other side, still in business, but making far more modest gowns. Not to be forgotten, here the bottom left is Charles Frederick Worth, who founded the House of Worth. He was credited as being the inventor of haute couture, also called the Napoleon of costumier. And here is where, if women, wealthy women, were not going to the Bon Marché or Galeries Lafayette to have their dresses made, they were being made at the House of Worth, which he had an army of tailors numbering 1,200 at one point, making these extravagant gowns, dramatic fabrics and lavish trimmings, unbelievably expensive, and people of wealth, is said, ordered them by the dozens. He invented the princess line and ended the crinoline era. He introduced the new silhouette that we see here in the brown dress at the bottom, in which gone was the hoop skirt and welcomed was the bustle at the back. He also invented the walking skirt, which had a shocking ankle-length hemline. And he was the first to sew his own label into a gown. Now, a big part of the story of fashion in Paris is the couturières, the fortunes and really empires built by Coco Chanel, Christian Dior, and Yves Saint Laurent, legends in their own right, just geniuses of fabric. If we go to the next slide, I wanted to point out that if you do have the opportunity to go to Paris, a couple places you really want to visit are the Galeria Dior, by the House of Dior, the Museum of Dior, in which you walk through these amazing exhibits surrounded by these designs. And also nearby is the Musée Saint Laurent, Yves Saint Laurent. This is the home that he shared with his partner, Pierre Berger. You walk through the home, and including walking through, as you see there at the bottom center, that's his atelier, his workshop. Pens on the table, messy drawings all over. It looks like Yves Saint Laurent just walked out the door, and you're standing there looking at that. Also of note, of course, the famous Louis Vuitton Museum there at the bottom right in the Bois de Boulogne, and also Cartier has a museum, which is not fashion, but rather of art. And so we come to the triumph of the brand and the triumph of the co-brand of the next slide, in which very few designers or brands call themselves just Dior, Lancôme, Lenotre. They are Louis Vuitton Paris, Dior Paris, Lancôme Paris, as are the stores Galeries Lafayette Paris, Printemps Paris. Paris is the ultimate co-brand, but as we see in the next slide, if you will, it seems that the ultimate brand is Paris itself. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. If we have any time for a couple of questions, I welcome that, Renee.
Yes, thank you, Roger, so much. And there are a couple of questions, and there are a couple that I didn't get to either. So if we have time, hang on one second.
Mhm.
Um, Robbie Weinman is asking, were any women members of guilds?
I'm not aware that they were. That's an excellent question. I'll have to look and see if that was true. I do not think so. It was a man-to-man profession. It was a father to son, grandfather to son profession. I don't know if there were any guilds in women's professions, say if there was a guild of midwife or guild of a dressmaker, perhaps. That's a good question, and I'll have to say I don't know the answer to that. I think not.
And Christine Cholat is asking, Roger, do you have any comment on the Bonjour campaign that was launched in the late 90s? to welcome customers to browse in smaller boutiques. Before that, regarder was very frowned upon, looking around.
Yeah.
It is interesting that you said les grands magasins welcomed browsers when boutiques were harshly criticizing this practice as recently as the 1990s.
Well, I must say, I don't have any problem going into boutique. I don't go into Dior. Actually, I did go into Dior and got the looks. But I'm intimidated to go into certain high-end shops. But yeah, boutiques I think are very welcoming if you're certainly aware of the protocols. I mean, you're certainly going to be welcomed by the owner. You're certainly going to speak up and thank them and so forth. There is that, but I don't have a problem with that. Interestingly, greeting, the bonjour thing, is something I saw at Bon Marché where the suits came around. There was a group of about, oh, six or so obvious executives who walked through Bon Marché saying bonjour, 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 just to nobody and everybody at once. So, yeah, both sides are trying, I think.
So let's see. I know there was a question about the Marie Antoinette program that you're talking about
Oh,
on
yeah.
PBS. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I
Or
mean
how we
it's
find it? And then we have, I think, one or two more
it's
questions.
it's been on PBS Sunday nights, and if you have PBS Passport, I think it's called, if you're a member, that you can stream it, I believe. But yeah, I find it a fascinating program. It concentrates on Marie Antoinette as this kind of child bride who had her struggles and we're approaching the revolution, but we're not there yet. And it's fascinating. And of course, fashion is a huge part of it. And they show her, in fact, getting dressed, the formal réveillé, and the when the monarchs were dressed before a whole court that stood there, as many as 50 people in their bedroom, getting them dressed or undressed and put to bed and so forth. So it's quite it's quite a fashion show.
And just one more thing, you've talked about women, we've asked about women in guilds, and did the role of women really change greatly with this, with the whole sort of your bourgeois lifestyle that was
Well,
reflected in the Grand Magasin?
um, let's think about that. One of the features of the emergence of these stores, and then the celebrated Belle Époque, which we're talking about the 1870s to 1913 when the war started, the long century, some people call it. That was a period in which people in general came out of their enclaves. The renovation of Paris from 1852 to 1870 had opened up many neighborhoods and created boulevards and promenades and gardens and so forth, places to be seen. So I think people in general were very much more out in the open, and women had a changing role in that. I think they were very much in the forefront. You could uh, point to figures such as, I don't know, Sarah Bernhardt, for example, the celebrated actress, or women in business that we've highlighted a few that had new roles. Yeah, I think the role of women were changing. I don't know if that answers that question that much, but I think that women were far more visible, and fashion was very much a part of that, seeing and being seen.
Well, thank you so much, Roger. I think we're out of time. We have so many people saying they never thought they'd be interested in fashion, but this has been historically so fascinating. And so you're on the hook for
Yeah. Okay.
okay.
Well, my fashionista daughters say, Dad, you're going where? You're doing what? You hate that
Let me
stuff.
ask you one more question.
Yeah.
I understand there's a Grand Magasin in New York that maybe people aren't aware of.
Oh, yes, indeed. Just last month, the Printemps opened a store. It's down on Wall Street. Went to take a look on Renee's and Melissa's suggestion last week. It is really glorious. It's really beautifully done. A microcosm, a small version of the Printemps in Paris, but it's a beautiful experience. The way it is designed, you're going through these kind of channels and different moods, and the Salon de Chaussure, the shoe department is really something to behold. So it's worth a trip to have a look-see there. And now perhaps the tariffs are lifted for at least a month and a half. I was going to say those $1,000 shoes were going to be 1,500 or 2,000. Maybe you have a reprieve, or you should go do a pre-tariff shopping experience at Printemps, New York, down on Wall Street.
On that note, let's go shopping. And thank you so much for this incredible history of Le Grand Magasin in Paris and fashion.
Thank you so much.